Rain hammered against the carriage roof, loud enough to drown out the sound of proprieties snapping. Genevieve hadn't meant to fall asleep. She certainly hadn't meant to use the Duke of Ashbourne as a pillow. What he did next didn't just ruin her reputation. It entirely dismantled her reality. Bone-deep exhaustion possesses a specific gravity. It pulls at the jaw, drags down the shoulders, and makes the very air feel thick, like breathing through wet wool. Genevieve Hale had reached this state 3 days ago, yet she was still functioning, propelled entirely by the brittle, frantic energy of a woman who could not afford to collapse. Sitting rigidly in the poorly sprung hired carriage, she stared straight ahead into the gloom. The interior smelled of damp leather, stale lavender water, and the sharp, metallic tang of the torrential storm raging outside. Her boots were soaked through. Cold seeped from the floorboards, traveling up her shins and settling into her knees with a dull, persistent ache. Directly across from her, a small mountain of velvet hat boxes and brass-cornered trunks occupied the entirety of the forward-facing bench. They belonged to the Dowager Lady Clementine, Genevieve's employer, a woman whose sudden claustrophobia had miraculously cured itself the moment an alternative carriage, one devoid of poor companions and filled instead with pampered pugs, presented itself at the last coaching inn. This left Genevieve to share the rear-facing bench with Nathaniel, the Duke of Ashbourne. He had been thrust into this miserable conveyance when his own carriage threw an axle 2 miles past the toll gate. Protocol dictated he ride with the men outside, or requisition a horse, but the storm was biblical, blinding and violent, and so the Duke of Ashbourne sat mere inches from Genevieve's left elbow, wrapped in a massive, obscenely dry wool greatcoat. He had not spoken a word since climbing inside. Genevieve dared not look at him directly. She caught glimpses only in the erratic flashes of lightning, the sharp, unyielding line of his jaw, the severe cut of his collar, the imposing breadth of his shoulders, taking up far too much of the cramped space. He emanated heat. It was entirely unfair. He sat there, a fortress of aristocratic invulnerability, while she shivered violently beneath a threadbare pelisse that had lost its battle with the damp an hour ago. The carriage violently jolted as a wheel found a deep rut in the mud. Genevieve's teeth clamped together to keep from biting her tongue. Her shoulder knocked briefly, disastrously, against Ashbourne's arm. "My apologies, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice sounding raspy and thin against the drumming rain. He shifted slightly. Leather creaked. "Mind the sway, Miss Hale," came his reply. His voice was low, carrying the gravelly texture of a man who was profoundly annoyed, but too well-bred to shout about it. It lacked warmth. It lacked anything, really, except the sheer weight of his station. Genevieve locked her hands in her lap, her fingernails digging into the cheap poplin of her gown. She just needed to stay awake. It was only another 20 miles to the estate. But the rhythmic, hypnotic swaying of the carriage was beginning to feel like a slow-moving pendulum. Her eyelids felt like they were lined with sand. For the past 72 hours, she had managed the dowager's tantrums, fetched forgotten shawls from drafty drawing rooms, and navigated the treacherous whispered insults of women who wore gowns worth more than Genevieve's life. She had eaten nothing but cold toast and half a cup of tepid tea since dawn. "Do not close your eyes," she told herself firmly. "Do not." She focused on a brass button on one of the trunks opposite them. She traced its circular edge with her mind, but the button began to blur. The sound of the rain shifted, turning from a violent clatter into a low, rushing hush. The cold biting at her feet started to feel distant. Her chin dropped to her chest. She snapped it back up with a violent jerk, her heart hammering in panic. She cast a terrified sideways glance at Ashbourne. He was staring out the window into the pitch-black night, his profile illuminated briefly by another flash of lightning. He looked thoroughly bored. Genevieve exhaled a shaky breath. She sat up straighter. She pinched the skin on the back of her hand until it stung. But the exhaustion was a living, breathing predator in the dark carriage, and it was patient. 10 minutes passed, or perhaps 10 seconds. Time had lost its structure. The carriage hit a long, smooth stretch of road, the wheels humming a low, vibrating lullaby. Genevieve's head felt impossibly heavy. The muscles in her neck, strung tight for 3 days, finally, treacherously, surrendered. She swayed to the left. The swaying carriage tipped her further. The descent was slow, a tragic, unavoidable collapse of physics and fatigue. Her head fell, not against the cold, rattling glass of the window, but against something solid, something impossibly warm. The shock of it should have jolted her awake immediately. The texture against her cheek was thick, expensive broadcloth, smelling faintly of cold rain, saddle soap, and the dark, bitter edge of black tea. It was a masculine scent, entirely foreign and entirely forbidden. Her brain registered the catastrophe. You are sleeping on the Duke of Ashbourne. Every survival instinct screamed at her to bolt upright, to stammer an apology, to throw herself from the moving carriage rather than face his aristocratic wrath. Dukes did not tolerate the liberties of impoverished companions. He would shove her away. He would rap his cane against the roof and demand the driver halt. He would have her ruined, dismissed, cast out into the mud. She waited for the shove. She waited for the sharp intake of breath, the icy command to sit up. But her body betrayed her mind. The warmth radiating from his shoulder was intoxicating. It seeped into her freezing cheek, thawing the icy dread in her chest. The steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing beneath her ear was the most grounding sound she had ever heard. Before her conscious mind could force her muscles to obey, the dark, heavy blanket of true sleep pulled her under. Consciousness returned not with a gentle dawn, but with a sharp, humiliating, physical cramp. Genevieve's neck screamed in protest as she stirred. Her mouth was entirely dry, tasting of stale air, and something wet and horribly sticky was clinging to her lower lip. She inhaled sharply, her senses coming online in a chaotic rush. The carriage was no longer swaying. It was at a dead halt. The rain had reduced to a quiet, pathetic drizzle. But it was the sensory input immediately beneath her that paralyzed her. She was not just leaning on the Duke of Ashbourne. She was practically burrowed into him. Sometime during her unconsciousness, she had slipped further down. Her face was pressed firmly against the heavy lapel of his greatcoat. One of her hands was resting, palm flat, against the solid expanse of his chest. Beneath her ear, his heart beat with a slow, steady, maddening calm. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's blade, sliced through her. Genevieve bolted upright, her spine snapping straight. The sudden movement sent a spasm of pain down her neck, causing her to wince and utter a quiet, undignified sound. She slapped a hand over her mouth, frantically wiping away the mortifying trace of drool from her chin. She shrank back into the furthest, coldest corner of the bench, making herself as small as humanly possible. She stared at him, her chest heaving, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Nathaniel Ashbourne did not look outraged. In fact, he looked remarkably, unsettlingly serene. He was leaning back against the squabs, his long legs stretched out and braced against the opposite bench, effectively pinning one of Lady Clementine's hat boxes in place. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The interior of the carriage was still dim, lit only by the weak gray light of early dawn filtering through the wet glass. But she could see his eyes clearly. They were a pale, piercing gray, unreadable and utterly focused. He looked down at his shoulder. Genevieve followed his gaze. There, on the immaculate dark gray wool of his coat, was a distinct, wet patch. Her stomach violently dropped to her wet boots. She had drooled on a duke. She was going to die. No, death would be a mercy. She was going to be forced to live through this memory every day for the rest of her miserable life. "Your Grace," Genevieve croaked. Her vocal cords felt rusted. She swallowed hard, trying to summon whatever shreds of dignity she had left. "But I cannot fathom an apology sufficient for this. I was unwell. I was tired. I did not mean to—" "You snore, Miss Hale." The words were spoken flatly, devoid of any discernible emotion. Genevieve stopped breathing. She stared at him horrified. "I do not." "You do," Nathaniel corrected, shifting his broad shoulders slightly, as if working out a stiffness. It is not a polite, ladylike sound either. It is somewhat reminiscent of a wet hound trying to dislodge a bone. Her face burned with a heat so intense she felt she might spontaneously combust. She wanted to claw at the carriage door and throw herself into a ditch. "I beg your pardon. I will replace the coat. I will wash it myself. I swear to you, Your Grace, I have never—" "Stop babbling," he interrupted, though the harshness of the command was muted by a sudden, strange weariness in his tone. He reached inside his coat. Genevieve flinched, absurdly terrified he might pull out a pistol to end her misery. Instead, he withdrew a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a brief sip, and then, to her absolute bewilderment, held it out to her. She stared at the silver metal, gleaming in the low light. "What is that?" "Brandy," he said. "You look as though you are about to faint, and if you collapse on me again, I cannot guarantee I will remain a gentleman." Genevieve hesitated. The propriety of the situation was already a smoldering crater. Taking spirits from a bachelor's flask in a stationary carriage at dawn was merely throwing a pebble into the abyss. Her hands shook violently as she reached out. Her freezing fingers brushed against his bare skin. He was so warm, it actually burned. She took the flask, raised it to her lips, and drank. The liquid was liquid fire, scorching down her throat and hitting her empty stomach with a heavy, warming punch. She coughed, a harsh, ragged sound, and handed it back. "Thank you," she rasped. Nathaniel capped the flask and slipped it away. He looked at her again, his gaze entirely too assessing. It lacked the usual aristocratic disdain she was accustomed to. He wasn't looking at her as if she were dirt on his boots. He was looking at her like she was a puzzle missing a crucial piece. "Why did you not push me away?" Genevieve asked, the question slipping past her lips before her exhausted brain could catch it. It was too bold, too intimate. Nathaniel broke eye contact, staring back out the window at the dreary morning. The lines around his mouth tightened. "You were exhausted, Miss Hale," he said softly. The gravelly edge to his voice was gone, replaced by something heavier. "To push you away would have required an active effort. I found I lacked the energy to be cruel." It was a devastatingly honest answer. It stripped away the veneer of polite society entirely. "Besides," he added, a cynical, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corner of his mouth, "you had a death grip on my lapel. I suspected if I moved, you might have taken the entire coat with you." Genevieve looked down at her hands. If they were still trembling, she realized then what she hadn't noticed in her panic. He hadn't just tolerated her falling on him. He had accommodated her. He had shifted his position, bracing his legs against the opposite bench, to create a stable surface so she wouldn't slide off. He had sat perfectly still, likely for hours, enduring a stiff neck and a cramped back, simply so a dowager's ignored companion could sleep. The realization was terrifying. Cruelty she understood. Indifference she expected. But this quiet, unspoken act of protection from a man who owed her nothing, it terrified her because it made her look at him not as a duke, but as a man. And that was a luxury Genevieve Hale absolutely could not afford. "The carriage has stopped," she said, desperately needing to change the subject. She looked out the glass. They were sitting in the long driveway of the Ashbourne estate. Through the mist, the colossal stone facade of his ancestral home loomed like a dormant beast. "Yes," Nathaniel said. He finally turned to face her fully. The air in the small space seemed to shift, growing suddenly thick, charged with an unspoken tension that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. "We have arrived." He didn't move to open the door. He didn't call for the footman. He just looked at her, his pale eyes pinning her to the squabs. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating in the quiet carriage. "When the footman opens that door, we will return to being strangers. You will go back to fetching shawls, and I will go back to avoiding my relatives." "Of course, Your Grace," she whispered, her heart kicking against her ribs. He leaned in, just a fraction. The scent of black tea and rain enveloped her again. "But know this, I do not play the martyr. If I allowed you to rest against me, it is because I chose to." Do not let me catch you at apologizing for it again. Sunlight struck the carriage interior with the violence of a physical blow when the footman wrenched the door open. Genevieve blinked against the sudden, blinding glare. The quiet, suspended reality of the damp carriage shattered instantly, replaced by the chaotic noise of the Ashbourne estate coming to life. Gravel crunched beneath iron-shod wheels. Stable boys shouted to one another in the damp morning air. The heavy metallic clank of harnesses being undone rang out sharp and clear. Nathaniel moved first. He did not look at her. He did not offer his hand. He stepped out of the carriage with the fluid, thoughtless grace of a man who owned the ground he walked upon. Genevieve remained frozen for a fraction of a second, her hands gripping the edge of the velvet seat. The spot on the cushion beside her was empty, but the air still held his heat. She took a sharp, shallow breath, forcing the cold, damp morning air into her lungs to clear the lingering scent of his skin and the brandy. Strangers. That was the rule he had set. It was a rule she desperately needed to follow. She gathered her ruined pelisse around her shoulders, her fingers numb and clumsy. Stepping out of the carriage, her boots sank immediately into the wet gravel. The cold water seeped through the worn leather soles in seconds. The Ashbourne Manor loomed before her, a sprawling, terrifying monument of gray stone and dark glass. It smelled of wet ivy, wood smoke, and centuries of inherited wealth. It was not a welcoming house. It was a fortress designed to remind visitors of their exact, insignificant place in the world. Genevieve certainly felt hers. Before she could fully find her footing, a shrill voice cut through the courtyard. "Genevieve, good God, girl, where have you been hiding?" Lady Clementine was descending from her own, substantially drier carriage. She was flanked by 2 footmen and a shivering, flat-faced pug tucked under her arm. The dowager wore an expression of profound suffering, though her silk traveling gown was immaculate. "I was in the hired coach, my lady," Genevieve said, her voice dropping into the flat, subservient monotone she used as armor. She hurried forward, her wet skirts dragging heavily against the stones. "Also, you look like a drowned rat," Clementine sneered, her eyes raking over Genevieve's wrinkled dress and the erratic state of her hair. "And you smell of damp wool. Stand downwind for heaven's sake. The dogs are sensitive." Genevieve stopped. She swallowed the hard, bitter knot of humiliation in her throat. "Yes, my lady, I apologize. Shall I see to the trunks?" "Obviously," Clementine snapped, adjusting her grip on the wheezing dog. "My blue velvet needs immediate brushing, and I require tea. Real tea, not whatever muddy swill they served at that atrocious inn." Genevieve nodded, her shoulders slumping just a fraction. The exhaustion, briefly staved off by the shock of waking up on a duke, came crashing back over her with bone-crushing weight. Her neck throbbed, her calves cramped violently. She turned toward the pile of luggage being unloaded from the top of the coach. She reached for one of the heavy brass-bound hat boxes, her fingers slipping on the wet leather. It was absurdly heavy. She heaved it upward, her breath catching as the muscles in her back screamed in protest. "Leave it!" The voice was low, carrying effortlessly over the noise of the courtyard. Genevieve froze, the heavy box suspended awkwardly against her hip. She turned her head. Nathaniel was standing at the base of the massive stone stairs. He was in the process of stripping off his greatcoat, handing it to a waiting butler. The movement revealed the crisp, tailored lines of his dark waistcoat and the startling white of his linen shirt. He looked entirely unaffected by the brutal journey. He wasn't looking at Genevieve. His pale eyes were fixed entirely on Lady Clementine. "The footman will handle the baggage, Clementine," Nathaniel said, his tone deceptively mild, though it held the unyielding edge of an absolute command. "That is what I pay them for." Clementine bristled, her double chin quivering indignantly. "Nonsense, Nathaniel. The girl is perfectly capable. She needs to earn her keep after all, idle hands and all that." Nathaniel finally handed his coat away. Genevieve watched, a flush creeping up her neck, as the butler draped the heavy gray wool over his arm. The wool she had slept on. The lapel she had gripped like a lifeline. "My staff handles the luggage," Nathaniel repeated, his voice dropping slightly, stripping away any pretense of polite suggestion. "Miss Hale is a companion, not a beast of burden. She will go inside and find a fire. You will go to the morning room." Clementine opened her mouth, her face mottling an ugly shade of red, but the sheer, oppressive weight of the Duke's stare silenced her. She snapped her jaw shut, huffed loudly, and marched up the stairs, the pug whimpering in protest at being squeezed. Genevieve stood perfectly still, the rain beginning to mist around her again. She didn't know what to do with the box. A footman stepped forward, smoothly, taking the heavy leather from her hands without a word. She looked back up at the stairs. Nathaniel had already turned away, his broad back to her as he walked through the heavy oak doors into the warmth of the hall. He had not glanced in her direction. He had not offered a reassuring nod. He had simply altered the environment to his liking and moved on. Genevieve shivered, wrapping her arms around her own waist. Her ribs ached. He was keeping his promise. They were strangers. Yet, as she slowly climbed the stone steps, her wet skirts clinging miserably to her legs, she realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't saved her out of kindness. He had done it because he disliked disorder, and she, with her bruised neck and her desperate, pathetic need for a moment of rest, was a chaotic, breathing reminder of a vulnerability she could not afford to feel. Dust tasted metallic, bitter, on the back of the tongue. Genevieve coughed quietly into her sleeve, careful not to make enough noise to draw attention. 2 days had passed since the carriage ride. 48 hours of fetching, carrying, and enduring Lady Clementine's escalating demands. The Dowager was convinced the estate's drafty corridors were intentionally trying to give her pneumonia. Genevieve was currently perched precariously on the 4th rung of a rolling mahogany ladder in the East Wing library. The room was cavernous, smelling heavily of ancient paper, dried leather, and the faint, stinging scent of wood ash from the massive fireplace. Afternoon sunlight cut through the tall, mullioned windows in sharp, dusty slants, illuminating the thousands of volumes lining the walls. She was looking for a specific volume of translated Italian poetry. Clementine did not read Italian. Clementine did not read poetry. But another guest had mentioned it at breakfast, and the Dowager could not abide being intellectually outpaced. Genevieve stretched her right arm upward, her fingertips brushing the spine of a dark green book on the top shelf. The fabric of her worn day dress pulled painfully tight across her shoulders. The seams protested with a faint, tearing sound. She cursed under her breath, a decidedly unladylike word she had picked up from a stable boy years ago. "You are going to fall." The voice came from the shadows near the fireplace. It was rough, quiet, and intimately familiar. Genevieve's hand jerked. Her boot slipped on the polished rung of the ladder. For a sickening second, gravity claimed her, her stomach bottoming out. She grabbed the side rail with both hands, her knuckles turning white, her breath leaving her in a harsh gasp as the ladder swayed dangerously. Before settling, she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for her heart to stop hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she turned her head. Nathaniel was sitting in a deep, leather wing-back chair that had been turned away from the door, completely concealing him from the room's entrance. He had a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a ledger resting on his thigh. He wore no jacket. His cravat was untied, hanging loose around his collar. He looked entirely too comfortable and entirely too dangerous. "Did you find it necessary to sneak up on me, Your Grace?" Genevieve demanded, the adrenaline making her reckless. The polite, subservient mask she wore for the rest of the house slipped, exposing the raw, frayed nerves underneath. Nathaniel didn't flinch at her tone. He took a slow sip from his glass. "I was here first, Miss Hale. It is my library. You are the one climbing my furniture like a desperate squirrel." Genevieve flushed hot, defensive anger spiking in her chest. She carefully descended the ladder, her legs trembling slightly. When her feet hit the solid oak floor, she smoothed down her skirts with shaking hands. "Lady Clementine requested a book," she said, her voice stiff, reverting desperately to her formal tone. "I will return later when the room is unoccupied." She turned to leave. She just wanted to get away from the smell of his tea and the weight of his pale eyes. "Wait," It wasn't a request. It was an order. Genevieve stopped, her back to him. Her fingernails dug into the palms of her hands. She heard the soft thud of the leather ledger being placed on a table, the clink of glass against wood, then the slow, heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards. He was walking toward her. Every instinct told her to run, for the air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. He stopped directly behind her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that the memory of his shoulder, beneath her cheek, hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You look worse than you did in the carriage," he noted, his voice dropping slightly, skimming over the fine hairs at the nape of her neck. Genevieve swallowed hard. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace. You are a terrible liar." He stepped around her, placing himself between her and the heavy double doors. He looked down at her. In the harsh afternoon light, she could see the faint lines of fatigue around his own eyes, though they did nothing to soften the brutal architecture of his face. He reached up and, without asking permission, pulled the dark green book from the shelf beside her head, the one she had been straining to reach. He held it out, but didn't release it when she grabbed the other side. "Why do you stay with her?" he asked. The question was blunt, stripping away layers of societal pretense. Genevieve tugged at the book. He held fast. "Because she pays me an allowance, Your Grace." "An allowance?" he scoffed softly. "She treats you like a scullery maid with a better vocabulary." "And what would you have me do?" Genevieve snapped, the exhaustion finally overriding her fear. She looked up, meeting his pale, piercing gaze directly. Her eyes burned. "Should I quit? Walk out into the mud and politely ask a tree for shelter? I do not have a sprawling estate, Your Grace. I do not have a title to shield me from the cold. I tolerate Lady Clementine because starvation lacks a certain elegance." The words echoed in the massive room, sharp and bitter. She immediately regretted them. She had overstepped. She had spoken to a duke as if he were a man standing in a tavern. She waited for the reprimand, for the cold, aristocratic dismissal. Instead, Nathaniel's grip on the book loosened. He stared at her, the cynical amusement draining from his expression, replaced by something dark and intensely focused. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there for a fraction of a second, before snapping back up to her eyes. "You are remarkably combative for a woman entirely dependent on the goodwill of others," he murmured, his voice dangerously soft. "I have found that goodwill is a myth, Your Grace," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled the book free from his grasp. "There is only endurance." She clutched the volume to her chest, a useless paper shield, and walked past him. He didn't stop her this time, but as she reached the doors, she felt the heavy, undeniable weight of his stare following her, burning a hole straight through the cheap, tearing fabric of her dress. Midnight held a hollow weight inside the Ashbourne estate, amplifying the suffocating silence of a house built to outlast its occupants. Genevieve stood in her cramped, unheated attic room, staring blindly at the small canvas satchel on the cot. Her hands were entirely numb. The air up here tasted of cold soot and dry rot, catching in the back of her throat with every shallow breath. 2 hours ago, Lady Clementine had noticed a missing pearl ear bob. The resulting hysteria was not a search, it was an execution. Clementine needed a scapegoat to vent her generalized misanthropy upon, and a destitute companion was the perfect target. The accusation was swift, venomous, and absolute. There was no search of Genevieve's belongings, only a screaming dismissal and the threat of the magistrate if she was not gone before dawn. Genevieve reached out, brushing the rough hemp of the bag. Inside lay her entire, accumulated worth. 3 pairs of darned stockings, 2 faded day dresses, and a hairbrush. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to comfort them. Her chest simply felt locked, iron bands tightening around her ribs. She slung the satchel over her shoulder. The strap bit violently into her collarbone, a sharp, grounding pain that forced her frozen legs to move. Navigating the servants' stairs in the pitch black was an exercise in desperation, The narrow stone steps smelled of lye soap and the creeping dampness of the cellars. Reaching the heavy iron-bound door at the rear of the kitchens, Genevieve grasped the freezing latch. She hauled it backward, the hinges groaning softly, and stepped out into the night. Winter had snapped its jaws shut over the estate. The courtyard was bathed in harsh, silver moonlight. Frost coated the cobblestones, crunching like broken glass beneath her thin boots. The air was brutally sharp, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her throat, teeth chattering instantly. The village coaching inn was 5 miles away. She had no money, but she could perhaps sit by the hearth until morning. She took 3 steps toward the arched gateway. You will not make it past the toll road before the frostbite takes your toes. The voice sliced through the freezing air, low and rough. Genevieve flinched violently. She spun around, her heart slamming against her sternum. A shadow detached itself from the deep darkness beneath the stable eaves. The sudden flare of a cheroot illuminated the sharp angles of Nathaniel's face for a fraction of a second before dying down to a glowing orange cherry. The rich scent of burning tobacco and cedar wood rolled across the frosted yard. He wore dark breeches and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, wholly ignoring the biting cold. He looked dangerous, a man reduced to his fundamental architecture. "What are you doing out here, Your Grace?" Genevieve rasped, her voice shaking. Nathaniel took a slow drag from his cheroot. "I could ask you the same, Miss Hale, though the canvas sack rather spoils the mystery." He exhaled a plume of gray smoke. Clementine threw her tantrum loud enough to wake the hounds. The pearl was found under her dressing table 10 minutes ago. Genevieve stopped breathing. A sickening wave of dizziness washed over her. "She found it?" "Yes." Nathaniel tossed the cheroot onto the cobblestones, crushing it beneath his boot heel. He closed the distance between them with slow, predatory grace. "Which means your dramatic midnight exodus is unnecessary." "It is entirely necessary," Genevieve choked out, the tightly coiled spring of her endurance finally snapping. "She looked at me and decided I was a criminal because I am poor. That does not wash away just because she found her jewelry." Nathaniel stopped 2 feet away. His pale gray eyes swept over her shivering frame, lingering on her white knuckle grip on the bag. "So you will walk 5 miles in the dark and freeze to death on a point of pride?" "It is the only thing I have left," she shouted. Hot tears finally spilled over her lower lashes, freezing almost instantly against her cheeks. "You do not know what it is to be a breath away from the gutter every single day. I cannot endure her anymore. I cannot endure this." She turned away, intent on walking out the gates. Nathaniel moved faster than a man of his size should. His hand shot out, long fingers wrapping around her upper arm in an immovable grip. He jerked her backward. The canvas satchel slipped from her shoulder, hitting the frosted cobblestones with a muffled thud. "Let me go," she hissed, slamming her free hand against his chest. It was like striking a brick wall. "Stop fighting me," he growled, stepping into her space and pinning both her arms against his chest. The heat coming off his body was staggering. Genevieve struggled, a panicked writhing. "Let me go." "No." The word was absolute. She stopped, her breath hitching in a ragged sob. She looked up at him, chest heaving. Nathaniel stared down at her, the mask of indifferent nobility entirely shattered. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked erratically in his cheek. "You are not walking out of my gates, Genevieve," he said. The sound of her Christian name on his lips was heavy and devastating. "I did not sit in a damp carriage and let you drool on my best coat just to let you freeze to death in my driveway." "I have no position here," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "You are not going anywhere." Nathaniel released her wrists, his hands coming up to frame her freezing face. His calloused palms were blistering hot against her icy skin. "Clementine is leaving tomorrow. I am banishing her to Bath. You are remaining here." "Remaining as what?" "Remaining as my problem," he murmured. He leaned down, his forehead resting lightly against hers. The scent of him enveloped her entirely. "You fell asleep on my shoulder, Miss Hale. You crossed the line. Did you truly think I was going to let you walk away from the consequences?" He didn't wait for an answer. Nathaniel shifted his hands to the back of her neck. tangling his fingers in her damp hair, and pulled her firmly against his chest. He crushed her against his heartbeat, shielding her from the bitter wind with his own body. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut. Her trembling fingers curled desperately into the fabric of his shirt. She had spent her entire life trying not to fall. But as the Duke of Ashbourne wrapped his arms around her in the freezing courtyard, Genevieve realized something absolute. She had already fallen, and he had caught her. Did Nathaniel's bold move leave you gasping? What started as a disastrous carriage ride has now defied every rigid rule of high society. If you love this deeply emotional, slow-burn historical romance, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. Share this video with your romance-loving friends and tell us in the comments, how would you have reacted in Genevieve's shoes? Stay tuned for more captivating stories and dramatic conclusions.